Hello and good afternoon. I'm Rachel Patton, Executive Director of Preserve Arkansas. Preserve Arkansas is the statewide nonprofit advocate for historic preservation. Welcome to Women in Preservation, the series that features women who are working to save historic places. I want to thank our series sponsor, DMX Architecture in Fayetteville, for their generous support of women in preservation. Many of you are members of Preserve Arkansas, and we thank you for your generous support. If you're not a member, please join us. Our memberships are vital to our organization's survival and to us being able to achieve our mission of saving Arkansas's historic places. Memberships may be paid annually, quarterly, monthly. We have all kinds of options to work with you, and they come with benefits like the swag you see on the screen, as well as discounts to our events. Save the date for these upcoming Preserve Arkansas events. Hopefully you received in the mail recently a save the date card for our upcoming statewide historic preservation conference that'll be held at Hot Springs from October 21st through the 23rd. Registration will be available very soon for that, and as well as our Ramble. This year's Ramble is also going to Hot Springs on November the 7th. And the Ramble is a bus trip that will start in Little Rock and take attendees to Hot Springs, where we will visit sites associated with the gambling history of Hot Springs and that are inspired by David Hill's book, The Vapors. People will also receive a copy of the book in advance of the Ramble, and the author will be there to do a book talk during the Ramble. So stay tuned for that as well. Those will be available this summer. Join us next month for Women in Preservation with local historian Susan Young from Fayetteville. Some of you may know Susan from her decades of working at the Shiloh Museum in Springdale. She's now retired and serves on the boards of Historic Cane Hill, Heritage Trail Partners, and the Butterfield National Historic Trail Association. So join us again for Women in Preservation on June the 9th. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Ellie Isaacs. Ellie is partner in Landmark Preservation Consulting, LLC, based in Savannah, Georgia, with a presence in Atlanta and in Hot Springs, Arkansas. The firm is dedicated to the thorough assessment and preservation of historic buildings and sites in the Southeast. Ellie holds a BFA from the Savannah College of Art and Design in Historic Preservation with minors in Architectural History and Interior Design. Upon graduation, Ellie lived and worked in Hot Springs as a historic preservationist and designer for Taylor Kempkis Architects. Her notable projects included the rehabilitation of the Thompson Building, now the Waters Hotel in Hot Springs, and the historic Rappleyard House, now the Argenta Flats office in North Little Rock. Returning to Savannah in 2017, Ellie joined a local architecture firm as an on-staff historic preservation specialist before joining Landmark Preservation, LLC in 2020. She grew the consulting arm of the company to be able to officially form Landmark Preservation Consulting with managing partner Greg Jacobs in 2022. Ellie meets the professional qualifications for architectural history by the Secretary of the Interior. Ellie is a passionate advocate with an emphasis on resources tied to African American history, assisting clients to advocate and preserve their neighborhood, their building, their history, and their story. Ellie has managed projects of varying typologies and scales across multiple states and communities in the Southeast. Notable recent projects include comprehensive planning for Butler Island in Darien, Georgia, which is known due to its connection to the largest sale of enslaved persons in American history, and comprehensive planning for 6 buildings at Penn Center, the first school in the South for formerly enslaved West Africans on St. Helena Island. For almost 4 years, Ellie has served as the preservation consultant for First Bryan Baptist Church, which is recognized as the oldest African American Baptist church in America and is located on what is arguably the oldest parcel of real estate continuously owned by Black people in the United States. Wow. In that role, she has successfully led and managed multiple preservation planning and construction projects, including securing more than $375,000 in national level preservation grant funding and advised the church as consulting party through the Section 106 process for the surrounding neighborhood of Yamacraw Village. Welcome, Ellie. Let me stop sharing so you can share.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, it looks good.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction, Rachel. Happy Preservation Month, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today to discuss a topic that is very significant to me and has become even more significant with each passing year that I spend in this field, and even with each passing project. Privilege in preservation, moving beyond recognition to accountability and equity. We're going to discuss what that means from my point of view, using examples of projects I've completed in the South, some of which Rachel just mentioned, and as someone who fully acknowledges the privileges that I hold and how I intentionally aim to use that privilege to advocate, strategize, and support communities that have not always had those same advantages. We're going to discuss the common factors between these examples and then how you can help in your communities. So let's jump in. To start, let's form a foundation as to what privilege means. As you can see on the screen and straight from an online dictionary, privilege means a special right, privilege, a special right, benefit, or advantage that some people have and others do not. To take it a step further, special rights can be a formal right that is granted by a law or by a career position. And a special advantage can come from belonging to a particular group, which can be based on race, gender, or class, which is often unearned, also often unrecognized, and often taken for granted. So I'm going to pose a few questions for all of you to consider as we move forward. When heritage reflects privilege, who benefits? Who shapes the past starting today, and shapes the past as we know and have learned about it in the present? Who gets left out? Sit on those questions first, or like for a few seconds, and then we will move forward. So I think it is fair to say who and what gets preserved is not neutral. Neutral meaning those decisions are not unemotional decisions, they're not unbiased, and they're usually not equitable. In the field of preservation, and all of its many facets, is, and notice I said is, not as in past tense as not as in past tense. The field of preservation is shaped by access, influence, and inherited advantage. And that applies at any level, whether that's local, statewide, regionally, or nationally. That affects which histories, those tangible and intangible, which buildings, sites, and neighborhoods are recognized, saved, supported, and sustained, both short and long term. So, what is privilege in the field of historic preservation? Based on my research and my personal experience, there's two distinct types. There's heritage privilege, and then there's also professional or systematic privilege that are often interwoven. Heritage privilege is a systematic tendency to prioritize the recognition, protection, and funding of specific historic sites. These sites are typically those associated with famous, elite, white, or the dominant cultural narrative of an area, and are typically buildings featuring high-style architecture. This is where the concept of whitewashing the official history comes in. Because as a result of heritage privilege, the exclusion of marginalized or minority community heritage occurs. This is not limited to physical resources, but includes intangible heritage as well, and even archaeological heritage as well. These practices perpetuate the social, economic, and even environmental inequalities that have existed practically since this country's inception. The results include undervaluation of historic resources, gentrification, displacement, demolition, and loss of irreplaceable cultural history and the resources that are more common among the everyday person. Professional or systematic privilege relates to the professional standards that have been laid out by the National Park Service, so starting at the federal level. These standards include education and experience requirements that create institutionalized bias that can then be used and favored by regulatory or bureaucratic frameworks at the state and the local levels. It is then that these individuals and individuals like this that typically make up the organizations that, again, are more well funded and determine what constitutes as a historic resource. This results in who gets to participate and what is deemed, quote, worth saving. Heritage privilege is then integrated into creating the problem of prioritizing only certain types of history, favoring academic or archival documentation versus oral histories. And then also favoring formal academic architectural styles versus vernacular architecture that has typically changed or evolved over time. There have been eras in our collective history where the privileges are obviously evident. The most recent that I can think of is being urban renewal and redlining practices. But what most people don't typically accept or realize is that these privileges in the field of preservation still exist today. Has progress been made in the right direction? Absolutely. Is that progress evident or consistent across communities or states across the country? Absolutely not. They affect projects of every scale that I have worked on, from neighborhoods to landscapes to individual sites across multiple projects across the same city, across multiple cities in the same state, and across multiple states. We're going to look at the multiple examples within the categories that I've listed out on the screen. So to start, we're going to start with the first project where I fully acknowledged and realized on a much deeper level the privileges that I personally hold as a professional preservation consultant that does meet the NPS qualification standards and as a white person, and what I could do about it. I'm honored to have a working relationship with First Bryan Baptist Church, which is located in the Omicron neighborhood in Savannah, Georgia, for 4 years now. Rachel kind of said some of this already, but we're just going to reiterate. First Bryan Baptist is considered, again, the oldest continuous Black Baptist congregation in North America, and it sits on the oldest parcel of real estate continuously owned by African Americans in the United States. I could talk this entire time just about the significance of this building and the church's history and the people that have attended there that have made significant contributions not only in Savannah or the state of Georgia, but to the entire nation. But that's not what we're here to discuss today. So my relationship with them began by a simple referral. We began conversations and quickly realized that they were interested in a wide array of services, especially considering some of the threats to the surrounding neighborhood that we will discuss next. It was pretty early on while I was having a conversation on the phone with a member of the church who has now become a good friend, Anthony Maxwell, when he said something to me that literally changed my life. And I don't say that to sound exaggeratory, but it is the basis for the conversation that we're having today. He said, I have been trying to find out the information that you just shared with me for years. He was like, I've made calls and I've sent emails to numerous people and I've always gotten the runaround. He was like, and you picked up the phone and you called your people and you found out exactly what we've been trying to find out. He was like, thank you. Like, thank you for doing that for us. And it seems so simple, right? Just to have a simple thank you. But it was literally from that moment that I realized the privileges that I hold. And when I realized what my purpose was, how I could help in these communities. And of course, I don't say that to say, oh, look at me, like coming in and saving the day. I'm saying that by me being able to use my connections to help them, but to also be transparent through that process, I was gaining trust in a system that has long been broken. Years down the line, I was having a conversation with the church historian, Georgia Benton, and she is in that photo with me and her son on the screen. We were discussing writing a book together. And transparently, we still haven't written this book. But we just circled back on it not that long ago. So hopefully it'll happen soon. Anyway, in one of those initial conversations, she was expressing some hesitancy. And I paused and I looked at her and I said, Georgia, I need you to understand something. I said, I don't want to pursue this for me. Like, I genuinely want to do this with you and for you because she is an older lady, right? And she deserves to have this recognition for all of this effort that she has put in for numerous years. All of the knowledge in her head and that she's researched, needs to be put on paper for everyone to know. And I told her, I said, like you deserve that, and the church deserves that, and the community honestly deserves that as well. And I had to tell her that like this effort wasn't about me, right? I said, this is about what I can do to help you make it happen. And I will never forget how she looked at me and how our relationship evolved after that. And I realized that that is the difference. It is not about me getting recognition or notoriety. It is about me being able to assist them in what they are fully capable of doing themselves. Even if you don't take anything else away from this conversation today, please let it be that mindset. It is not about me and it is not about you. It is about assisting people in what they're fully capable of doing themselves, and they might just need some help. Another facet in this relationship is that First Bryan sits within the Yamakra neighborhood. Yamakra, as the name suggests, started as an Indian settlement and turned into the melting pot of Savannah. That's kind of what it's known as. Housing African Americans, Irish, Germans, immigrants, etc. It was like this until the 1930s when the city deemed the area a slum and demolished every single building but First Bryan. And the only reason why First Bryan wasn't demolished was because of how their deed was written, and displaced approximately 3,000 people. The segregated Yamakra Village Public Housing Project was constructed in 1939, and it is the second one that was built ever in Savannah, and it is now the oldest one still standing. This was a very early urban renewal project to enhance a main highway entrance into Savannah, and the architecture itself is racist. The bottom right image shows the community center and clinic that is a replica of a nearby plantation house that no longer stands. And it was to be surrounded by public housing units occupied by African Americans. So I will let you put those connections together yourself. There were also claims that this design was intentional to create a roadside attraction for travelers because homes across the South were starting to gain tourism off of their old plantation homes. And although this concept didn't really hit peak interest until the 1960s and 70s, Savannah had none left. So they were trying to capitalize, I guess you could say, while they could. For the last 10 years, this area has been under threat to be what historian Lawrence Vail coined a twice cleared slum, to be redeveloped with no written agreement to provide right of first refusal to current residents or confirm a set amount of low-income housing units that will be replaced or guarantee to help them even find housing. The entire system has lacked transparency, consistency, and a whole laundry list of issues, again, that I could talk about this entire time. But what they have made sure to note is that they want to keep the replica plantation house, noting the architect who designed it when the entire neighborhood was designed by the same architect. We've heard city leadership state, and I quote, that this area is the most valuable undeveloped land in downtown Savannah. But it looks pretty developed to me. So, back to the point. This is an ongoing battle to get the church's representatives a seat at the table, to get the residents' voices heard. They have now contracted with three legal nonprofits, one local and two on the national scale. And the privileges being expressed by those in power are very obvious here. The next example involves two sites that are connected by a shared history. An example of an event that has, again, all levels of significance, but it isn't as well known or acknowledged as it should be. In 1859, arguably the largest sale of enslaved people in the United States took place at the Ten Brock Race Course on the outskirts of Savannah. 429 enslaved persons from Pierce Butler's plantations near Darien, Georgia, were sold in an event remembered as the Weeping Time. They refer to it as the weeping time because when the sale started, it started to rain, and it didn't stop until 3 days later when the last person was sold. And they also refer to it as, the weeping time because all of these families were being separated. And it was just a tragic, emotional event. The image on the left shows the island where some, but not all of the people of the enslaved people were brought to Savannah from. A few years ago, when the 1930s residence you can see in the photo was still standing, there were conversations about how to utilize the property. One proposal of turning the house into a microbrewery was presented. Thankfully, city leadership immediately shot it down. During that same time, a National Register nomination was in progress to give some recognition to the site's story, and the state, an entity of the state who owns the property, stopped it with zero recognition, zero explanation as to why that was happening. Since then, the house burned down from a vandal, and nothing has happened since. Other than a few Georgia Historical Society plaques at the front of the property near the highway, no other recognition or protections exist for this property. Despite the prevalence of historic monuments in the South, memorials to slavery are rare, if non-existent. It wasn't until 2008 that the city of Savannah and the Georgia Historical Society placed a marker near, not on, the site of the sale in Savannah. However, that is all that they've done. There's no interpretation, no National Register listing, no protection on the land. A school has been built on part of it. A highway has been built through it, as you can see on the image on the right. This is not for a lack of community nonprofits trying to purchase portions of the property to try to get the city to purchase portions of the property in order to memorialize it. We ended up facilitating a connection between one of those nonprofits to a national level foundation to attempt on acting on their behalf. And as far as I'm aware, they're still discussing those things. But again, privilege tends to exclude the parts of history that make people uncomfortable. Moving to an even bigger scale, neighborhoods, which can potentially become historic districts. Mechanicsville is a neighborhood in Atlanta, Georgia. And as you can see in our survey map on the right, the neighborhood was formed in direct connection with the railroad that runs along the entire western or left-hand side of the proposed district. This area has 200 to 300 contributing buildings. However, you can also see that there are large areas of vacant lots. You can see that a major highway system runs along the entire top and right-hand side of the map. This area was heavily impacted by urban renewal demolition to build the highway system, which is what that black and white photo shows, and how that resulted in this area being visually and literally cut off from the surrounding neighborhoods. The 1990s Olympification of the city also demolished blocks of buildings that were actually left after that in order to make surface parking lots for people to be shuttled over to the event. When we submitted a draft National Register nomination, we were told that we had to shrink the boundaries of the district in order to move forward because of the disconnection of resources and integrity. That's what that red and blue line on the map are, is they wanted the district to include those areas and then south, so to completely ignore the top portion of the map. They wanted us to shrink it because again, the disconnection of resources and integrity. When we fully explained the impacts of those broad patterns of history that shaped the way the neighborhood looks today. We appealed that decision to the National Park Service, which was denied. And now the client is in conversation with members of the House and Senate to change the National Register criteria and how that applies to neighborhoods like Mechanicsville that deserve to be saved, deserve to be recognized and saved from demolition and gentrification that has already started. North Rome is an area comprised of 3 neighborhoods in Rome, Georgia. One area that I wanted to highlight in particular, because again, it's how urban renewal changed a thriving Black mixed-use area known as Five Points. This area was almost completely demolished. There's literally one or two buildings left. The roads were widened, and all on the promise that other buildings would be built for the residents to move and reopen their buildings. And you can probably guess what happened. Absolutely nothing. Slightly smaller than neighborhoods, and most historic districts are cemeteries. Also affected by urban renewal, the LePageville Memorial Cemetery is all that remains of an entire freedmen's community that was deemed a slum as well and demolished by the city. Again, on the promise of a rebuild that never happened. The area has rich history and is currently being surrounded by development, blocking visibility from the main road. Thankfully, with listing on Historic Savannah Foundation's Endangered Places program, volunteers have begun cleaning up the property regularly, and another nonprofit has assisted them in applying for arboretum status and the creation of a master plan. Laurel Grove Cemetery is a municipal-owned segregated cemetery in Savannah as well. Founded in 1853, north was for white people and south was for Black people. Thankfully, they were both listed on the National Register. However, it's very apparent that throughout history and even today, that privilege plays a part in not only the heritage tourism of these cemeteries and the funding aspect of it, but also, again, urban renewal striked. Um, a highway connector and an exit was literally built through Laurel Grove South, as you can see from the center middle image, the bottom one with the red. It literally built a highway through the cemetery. A new Friends of Laurel Grove South nonprofit group, which I'm proud to say that I'm a co-founder of, has been created as of earlier this year with the aim of applying for grant funding and bringing much needed recognition to the history and people that are laid to rest here. Also affected by this very same highway, but not pictured here, is the Savannah's Mordecai Sheftall Cemetery, which is otherwise known as the Old Jewish Burial Ground, that has long been neglected as well. Most people don't even know that it exists. This cemetery is one of the oldest Jewish cemeteries in the country. It was founded in 1733 when Savannah was founded. The walls surrounding the cemetery sit literally, I kid you not, less than 3 feet from the highway on-ramp. Moving to the individual building scale, a common typology where privilege is most obvious, at least to me, are in house museums. I'm going to discuss some house museums I've worked with and others that I have not worked with to provide a well-rounded view of how privilege affects this particular typology. Most house museums seem to have evolved or are currently in the process of evolving to provide a broader context of the inhabitants of the house, typically those both freed and enslaved or indentured. However, the execution of how this full story context is displayed or portrayed varies. Some have online exhibitions only with little to no mention within the museum itself. Some have completely modernized those spaces that could have been used by enslaved or indentured persons, again, with little to no mention of these people or their stories. Some are actively trying to have those conversations with their board, again, filled with members who all have different perspectives and backgrounds, trying to determine how to best interpret these spaces that have long been covered up and to prioritize research in order to tell the full story. House museums of former plantations in Charleston have done a fantastic job with prioritizing extensive research, interpretation, forming descendants groups, hosting Gullah Geechee or cultural events, all in a greater effort to prioritize telling the full story. Two house museums leading these efforts in Savannah are the Owens Thomas House, which is at the center, the bottom center image, and the Davenport House, which is the top center image. The Davenport House is unique in that it was the second in Savannah to do extensive research on the formerly enslaved people of the home, to share what they know about their stories and properly interpret the ground level of the house. And they host cultural events in that space as well. The Davenport House was also a tenement house far longer than it was a residence to the original owner, which is what the house's current interpretation is focused on. But again, by prioritizing this extensive research, they've uncovered that the house was home to the first Chinese American immigrants in Savannah and their family's multi-generational story. They've hosted a photography exhibition, inviting descendants, hosting a Chinese New Year celebration, hosted a book talk from the granddaughter of the original tenement family, and their aim is to begin reinterpreting rooms of the house to reflect this period as well and incorporate that narrative into the tours. Telling the full story is critical, not only to provide tangible resources to connect and understand history with architecture and antiques, but to connect beyond that to the social, economic, and racial contexts of the periods that they represent. So, what commonalities occur between all of these examples? All of them are fighting for acknowledgement, inclusion, fighting for narratives to be recognized as significant, to not be destroyed by development, greed, or self-serving interests, fighting against the normalized standard practice and bureaucracy. Just because it's the way that it's always been done doesn't mean that it's the way that it still has to be done. Fighting for support from all levels, both from the community and financially. One unfortunate commonality is the issue with the National Register of Historic Places application process. And this is something that has come up across people in the field for years now, but it seems to be like it's getting more and more traction all the time. This process was not created in favor of narratives that are not backed up by archival evidence or vernacular architecture of the everyday person, or architecture that has evolved or changed over time, which is typical for underrepresented stories and working class neighborhoods. This process not only requires owner permission or neighborhood buy-in, but it takes more time than people typically expect, as it is a complex process that requires thesis level research to analyze sections like the criteria for evaluation and architectural significance, which results in a consultant like myself, and the costs of hiring one, which a lot of people, again, don't have. One key element that tends to be an objective perspective of reviewing entities is, again, stating that the area and the resources don't have enough integrity, like with the neighborhoods we discussed earlier. Integrity in this process is reviewed by 7 aspects: location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. And a lot of those seem to be pretty objective. But why does listing on the National Register of Historic Places even matter? Listed on the screen is a list of opportunities connected with listing. On the local level, it solidifies a narrative within the collective narrative of a place and gives you a connection to that place. It could help with tourism. It could aid in protection of those resources. And on the state and federal level, it provides opportunities in funding with grants and preservation tax credits. As I'm sure you're all aware, again, funding is typically a large part of the battle in recognizing and saving historic resources, both short and long term. So as we finish this conversation today, I would like you to examine how these dynamics operate and the role that you play within them, even if you are a community member somewhere with no basis of knowledge, and how the dynamics can be intentionally redirected to support the communities that have not always had equal access. How do we move beyond recognizing our privilege to take accountability and to ensure preservation is a tool for equity in our communities? So the big question, again, like everybody has asked, how do we change this? How do we like really change this? I've broken up strategies into 2 kind of sectors. My personal approach from the private sector on the left, and things that everyday people can do. These are things that everyday people can do and have the responsibility to do in their own communities. And on the right-hand side, what the responsibility is of government entities and nonprofit organizations, like what they should be doing. There's similarities, as you can see, in the overall big ideas, and some of them are probably pretty obvious, or you think that you're already doing them sufficiently. You could be, and that's very true. But the confirmation in that is represented in what you're showing and what you're offering the public through leadership, relationships, client lists, what you advocate for publicly, and what you prioritize. Are you really dialed in to local projects that are happening that don't directly impact you? It has to be a collective effort to make things more commonplace, to be more inclusive and more equitable. I've also included resources in italics that can be created and implemented, like authentic community engagement, publicly available tools, prioritization and research and documentation efforts, etc. Even as a member of the public and the private sector, it is up to you to be dialed in and to show up. As a member of the right-hand side of the table, it is up to you to make that as easy and as transparent as possible for someone who wants to get involved. We all have a responsibility to recognize our privileges, to take accountability for them, but to also genuinely make the effort to bring equity to all areas in our community. And that's what I have today. So thank you so much for listening, and for taking your time out of your day. I'm excited to hear what thoughts and questions you guys may have.
Thank you, Ellie. Fascinating topic
Yay.
and approach to the talk today. I mean, it's something that, as someone in the preservation field, that I absolutely know what you're talking about and agree with you, but it's maybe something that a wider group has not considered.
Right. And that's
Ryan,
that's something that I've talked about this with several people, both in the field professionally and not. And it is a interesting topic that a lot of people seem to kind of be aware of, but nobody's really, I think, talking about it on this kind of scale. So
mm-hmm.
I'm excited to hear everybody's
Uh,
thoughts and what
yeah, we've got a
questions
couple
people have.
comments. Let's see, you're something in the
Yeah.
Q&A. Oh, someone, Lauren Adkins asking, she said, great presentation. Are you planning to present it at NAPC forum?
Um, what in a what form? I'm sorry, say that one more time.
At NAPC at their summer conference,
Their summer conference? No, I have not planned on doing that.
but she is
But that's a really
presenting.
good idea, for the future. Thank you for that. I appreciate it.
She is presenting at the Arkansas Preservation Conference.
I am, yes, but not on this
Like,
topic.
oh,
I was gonna say that, but I didn't know if I should say that yet. So,
I think it's okay to say it.
yeah.
Okay, you've got some stuff in the comments here. I'm looking for questions in particular. Have you been able to build a coalition of other preservationists or even associated professions in your area to help scale up your work?
So I've definitely had this conversation with some like-minded people, like myself, but we have not formally formed any kind of coalition. No. But I think that we all do our best to kind of support each other in our efforts, once we make them known. So I will say that has been a good thing.
Thank you. Let's see.
I love that there's so
Someone,
many questions. This is
apologies
so good.
if you've already stated this, but how did you first become connected to the congregation at First Bryan Baptist?
So I didn't really say that. I just said it was based on a referral. So the other side of the company, Landmark Preservation, does hands-on restoration conservation work. They were actually in the square across the street from the church working on some of the monuments that are there. And someone ended up talking to one of those people that were there of the team. And they were kind of just talking about different things. And they said, "Oh, you should reach out to Ellie because she's the one that could help you with all of this." And that's where it started. Yeah. And now I'm an honorary member of the church. So I feel like that says something.
That does. That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So there's still more time to type questions if you have them or comments, and I'll make sure
Mm.
that Ellie sees all of this after the fact, even if you don't have a question, but a comment is fine.
Yeah.
And I
And I've
just,
included my email and my cell if anybody wants to private, send me an email with a question.
thank you. And I just want to add that, what you talked about, especially about the National Register
Yeah.
of Historic Places and the criteria for evaluation.
Yeah.
As someone who has worked for our state historic preservation office and then done it on the nonprofit side for the last 10 years and had to instill, being part of my job at both places, talking about how do you get something listed in the National Register? Why would you want to go through this process that takes you a year at minimum and
Yeah.
you have to work so hard? And, the answer is that's the key. That's how you get your foot in the door to get the funding.
Right.
And
And
also,
I
that's,
tell I could literally talk a whole time about just that too.
mhm,
Just because it is such a complex thing. And again, we had a committee with the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation, and this was one of the things that we had talked about was just the process and interpretation and the standards and things like that. And I know that Arkansas and Georgia share a similar NPS reviewer because of the region that we're all in. So that's kind of consistent across the states, but interpretation between the state offices because obviously there's different people. It varies from state to state. So
right.
that's also like an additional, I guess you could say, complication. Is
Mhm.
like the subjective or objectiveness rather of the standards and integrity and all of those things. So,
Yes, I agree with you. And I wish there was some way to, for us to make that change sooner and
mhm.
easier with the Park Service to make it easier and more attainable for the average person who is
Yeah,
not doing this as a consultant or as a professional preservationist to be able to fulfill the requirements and get something listed
yeah.
because it is a
It's
little,
hard. Yeah,
yeah. And when you present that and then you look at people's faces and you're like, they are not
yeah.
gonna, they're not gonna do this.
Well, and
You
I've
know,
even gotten to the point too where like if there's people that want to do it, attempt to do it themselves, you know, I say, obviously try, please do try, especially if you've done enough research already. You're kind of like a historian already. Um, it's just, I'll offer to people like, hey, I'll review your stuff for you at a much discounted rate because that usually helps. I can't charge nothing for it. But it's just, that's a thought too, is trying to
yeah,
start it or get advice first before you start and then again just kind of check in. But it is a usually, like you said, a minimum of a year, if not two. And there's typical like you do the draft and then you kind of go back and forth. At least in Georgia, it's like 2 to 3 times before you even get placed on an agenda. So
hmm,
it's a much longer process than people typically think.
yes. And in our experience, everything has gotten, it's harder to get things listed in the National Register in Arkansas than it's ever been. I'll just say that. And
Yeah.
that's not due to our staff. That's due to above them at the
Yes.
NPS level.
Yes. I wonder if that's the commonalities that we all share.
Yeah, but
But
it's
it's
it's a
also, and that's one of the things like I literally just went through a process with that was the first way that I've ever done it this way. It was a much more collaborative process with a family here in Savannah. And they had a lot of their own documentation and archival records themselves. Um, and the grandson of the original owner was very collaborative with me in that process. Yeah, and he and I mean I would equally say that we probably did 50-50 of the work. I mean that's how collaborative it was. And we finally went to we finally got it on the state register earlier this month. But it was one of those situations where again it's a single resource that we were listing under significant people tied to broad patterns of, tied to these events in history. And that nomination alone was over 40 pages for a single residence. And it's and it wasn't even being based on architecture. So it was kind of, it was one of those things where we felt like we had to over explain. And then there were certain things that, and again, it's an African American resource. And it was one of those things where we had made some really amazing genealogical connections between his grandmother and her great grandmother. His, you know, her great grandmother, so I guess his great 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 grandmother, was formerly enslaved on a plantation that was included on this land. So it was like all these generations later, they actually owned a piece of what used to be the plantation land and had owned it since like 1933. And their family still lives there today. Like they still reside on a piece of that property. So
Wow.
things like that, which are really moving and profound, right? And it was like I had to argue with the state historic, office to keep that as part of the narrative. Even if we weren't nominating it under that level of significance, it was like, no, this is a story that needs to be included. And, arguing in the most polite, professional way possible, but also just kind of like putting your foot down and saying, like, no, this needs to be in here. So that's also, I feel like, part of the battle half the time.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
So,
I agree with you.
yeah.
I have a question for you that's not related
Yeah,
to what we've been talking about, but um, you have been back in Hot Springs doing work
I
and you
have.
used to
Yeah,
live in Hot Springs. So
I
tell
did.
me, what is it that's so special about Hot Springs that keeps bringing you
That's a very good question. And it's something that I've been talking a lot about lately, because there are so many things in Hot Springs still to be done. And I think that's what keeps me going back is that Hot Springs has this multi-layered history that is very fascinating. And I feel like every time I'm there, I learn new things. Um, and I dive into, individual residences or people and discover new things and new connections. And there's a lot of potential in Hot Springs still, like a lot of places that are undeveloped, unrehabbed, that I have watched sit there since I lived there before. Um, which transparently, I lived there in 2014 to 2016. So it's like 10 years later, over 10 years later, some of those places are still sitting there. Um, and so that's very motivating for me to try to figure out how to save and rehab those properties. So that's what keeps drawing me back in. There's all kinds of things, but that's what it is. Yeah.
well, we all love Hot Springs, so I
Yeah.
can totally understand why you want to work there.
Yeah. And there's not a plethora of consultants like myself or people that have the knowledge or, again, the experience to help make those things move forward too. So it's kind of like, if we all team up together, we can make some
Right.
things happen. So,
Yes, absolutely. Okay. Well, thank you again so much for
yeah,
speaking. It was
thank you.
enlightening and wonderful. Thank you. And we'll see y'all next month for Susan Young on June the 9th.
Thank you. Thank you.